Daniel Crowe slammed the ranch gate against the wind. The wood cracked like a rifle shot. His left hand shook. Then he saw her. Clara Whitlock. On her knees in the dust. A widow crying like the prairie had finally broken her. Before Daniel could speak, a small voice cut the silence. A little girl stepped forward and took Clara's hand. "Let's go home, Mama." Daniel Crowe froze. Because the child behind him was his daughter. And the widow she chose had just changed his life forever. Before we ride deeper into the story, hit subscribe, ring the bell, so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Dust hung in the ranch yard long after the wind died. Daniel Crowe stood where he had frozen. Boots planted. Shoulders stiff beneath his work shirt. His daughter's small hand still rested in the widow's fingers. Clara Whitlock had stopped crying. Not because the pain was gone. Because something inside her had gone quiet. Emma Crowe looked up at her like the choice had already been made. Daniel stepped forward. Slow. Measured. The kind of step a man takes when trouble waits on every side. He reached for Emma's shoulder. Pulled her gently back. The girl resisted. Just enough to make him pause. Clara wiped dust and tears from her cheek with the heel of her hand. The black cloth of her widow's dress fluttered weakly in the wind. Daniel studied her. Thin. Tired. But standing. Most folks in the valley folded when the ground fell out from under them. This one hadn't. Not yet. "Road runs east," Daniel said quietly. His voice carried no anger. Just stone. "Town's 10 miles. Clara looked past him toward the empty hills. No wagon. No horse. Just prairie and wind. "That road leads to Walter Briggs," she said. The name settled into the yard like smoke. Daniel's jaw tightened. Emma looked between them. Children felt things before they understood them. Clara straightened her back. "I'm not going back there." Daniel said nothing. Behind them the barn door creaked. Loose hinge. Wind working the wood. The ranch felt the tension the way animals do before a storm. Emma stepped forward again. "Papa," she said softly. Daniel didn't answer. His eyes had drifted toward the western ridge. 3 dark shapes moved along the distant trail. Horsemen. Still far. But closing. Clara saw them too. Her fingers curled tighter around Emma's hand. "They'll come here first," she said. Daniel turned his head slightly. "Who?" "Men Briggs pays to make problems disappear." The wind lifted dust across the yard. Daniel rubbed his missing fingers against his palm. "Old habit. The kind a man carries after too many winters." Emma looked toward the ridge. "Are they bad men?" Daniel crouched beside her. His large hand brushed dirt from her sleeve. "Most men are," he said quietly. He stood again. The riders had crested the ridge now. No hurry in their pace. That meant confidence. Daniel studied the distance another moment. Then he walked toward the fence. Clara watched him go. Emma stayed beside her. Daniel lifted the latch. He didn't look back. "Barn's got work needing done," he said. The words floated across the yard like they didn't belong to the moment. Clara blinked. Daniel hooked the gate chain loose. "If you're staying," he added, "you earn it." Emma smiled. Small. Quiet. Clara looked once more toward the riders. Then toward the open barn. Hay smell. Warm wood. Shelter. She stepped forward. Emma walked beside her. Behind them the riders kept coming down the ridge. And Daniel Crowe stood waiting in the barn doorway. A man who had just made a decision he didn't yet understand. Morning came gray over the Crowe ranch. Frost clung to the fence rails. Thin. Sharp. Daniel Crowe was already working. A hammer rose and fell against a loose plank on the corral gate. Slow rhythm. Steel on nail. The kind of sound that fills empty mornings. Clara Whitlock stepped from the barn doorway with a bucket of water. Emma followed behind her carrying a smaller tin pail that sloshed with every careful step. Daniel didn't look up. The hammer kept moving. Clara crossed the yard. Set the bucket beside the trough. Cold air cut through the thin cloth of her widow's dress. Emma knelt and dipped her pail into the trough. "Cows drink first," the girl said. Clara nodded. Daniel's hammer paused. Just a second. Then it started again. A crow called from the cottonwoods along the creek. Wind whispered across the dry grass. Clara studied the ranch yard. A place built by hands that expected silence. Tools hung where they had been left. Rope coils neat. Saddles oiled. But the house looked different. The windows stayed closed. The porch chair sat empty under a thin coat of dust. Clara carried the bucket toward the house. Daniel's hammer stopped again. "You don't need that water there," he said. Clara turned. "For the stove. We cook outside till winter." The answer came flat. Like a rule carved in wood. Clara glanced toward the porch again. "House stays shut?" Daniel drove another nail. "Hard. House stays shut." Emma looked up from the trough. "But it gets cold at night, Papa." Daniel wiped sweat and frost from his brow. His eyes drifted toward the house without meaning to. Clara noticed. The front door. The small window beside it. Curtains still drawn tight. Like someone inside might wake if the light changed. Clara stepped closer to the porch. Daniel's hammer stopped. The yard went quiet. Clara rested the bucket on the step. "Windows need opening," she said. "Dust thick enough to plant corn in." Daniel walked toward her now. Slow. Boots crunching frost. "You work the barn," he said. "House ain't part of the bargain." Emma watched both of them. Her small hands wrapped around the trough rail. Clara folded her arms. "Barn's clean already." Daniel glanced toward the open barn door. She wasn't wrong. Hay stacked straight. Tools hung. Floor swept. The work of someone who refused to sit idle. Emma stepped between them. "Papa," she said softly. Daniel looked down at her. The girl pointed toward the porch window. "Sun makes the dust glow inside." Daniel followed her finger. Just for a moment. Light slipped through the curtain edge. Golden dust drifting inside the dark room. Clara spoke quietly. "Someone used to live there." Daniel's jaw tightened. Emma's voice came softer now. "Mama used to sing there." The words fell like stones into still water. Daniel turned away. His hand reached for the fence rail beside the porch. Gripped it. Hard. Clara saw it then. Not the missing fingers. Not the scar across his knuckles. The stillness. The way a man freezes when memory moves too close. Emma stepped onto the porch. Careful. Like she was entering a church. Her small hand touched the door. "Papa?" Daniel didn't answer. Wind stirred the grass. A board creaked somewhere on the barn. Clara waited. Emma pushed the door open a few inches. The smell of old wood and cold ash drifted out. Daniel moved fast. One step. Two. The door closed again under his hand. Hard. Dust shook from the frame. Emma flinched. Daniel knelt in front of her. His voice quiet. Too quiet. "That room stays shut." Emma looked at the ground. "Yes, sir." Clara watched him stand again. His shoulders stiff. Eyes fixed somewhere past the hills. "The woman who built that house," Clara said softly, "must have loved this place." Daniel didn't answer. But the silence changed. Heavy now. Full of something older than anger. Emma reached for Clara's hand. Clara squeezed it gently. Daniel picked up the hammer again. Walked back toward the corral. The sound of steel on nail returned to the yard. but slower now. Clara watched him work. Watched the way his hand trembled once before each strike. The kind of tremble a man hides from the world. But not from someone who has already lost everything. Across the valley a distant horse whinnied. Clara turned toward the ridge. Somewhere out there, men were riding. And the man trying to keep his house sealed against the past was about to learn that silence never holds forever. By sundown the air had turned mean. Cold wind came crawling out of the hills. It slipped through the fence rails, under the barn door, across the yard where Daniel Crowe stood at the chopping block splitting mesquite with short, hard swings. Each strike landed clean, heavy, controlled. The wood pile beside him had grown tall enough for 2 winters. He kept swinging anyway. Clara Whitlock carried feed to the hens. Emma followed with both hands wrapped around a basket of eggs. The girl walked careful, tongue pressed to her lip, trying hard not to stumble. One egg cracked anyway. A thin line of gold ran over her fingers. Emma stopped dead, looked at the broken shell, then at her father. Daniel lowered the axe, said nothing. That silence was worse than anger. Clara reached for the basket, took it gently. "One broken egg don't starve anybody," she said. Emma swallowed. Daniel bent, picked up the split log, and laid it on the pile with more force than needed. The sound bounced off the barn wall. Sharp. He looked toward the ridge. Not at Clara. Not at Emma. At the road beyond the pasture where trouble always seemed to begin. Clara watched him a moment. Then she gathered the kindling at her feet, stacked it beside the porch. The porch he still would not sit on. The door he still would not open. Dark came early. The sky turned iron blue. A horse appeared on the road. Then another. 2 riders. Slow and certain. Emma saw them first. Her hand found Clara's skirt. Daniel already had. He set the axe down against the block and walked to the gate with the same quiet pace that made men careful. The riders stopped outside the fence. Town men. Good coats. Bad eyes. One wore a black hat with a silver band. The other kept a shotgun across his saddle as if it belonged there. Neither smiled. The black-hatted man looked past Daniel toward Clara. "There she is." His voice carried easy. "Too easy. We've been asked to fetch Mrs. Whitlock." Clara went still beside the porch. Emma pressed closer to her. Daniel rested one hand on the gate post. "You've fetched all you're going to fetch today." The man in the black hat dipped his chin toward the valley. "Walter Briggs don't like delays." Daniel's face did not change. "Then he's living in the wrong country." The second rider laughed once through his nose. "Short. Ugly." The black-hatted man studied Daniel's left hand where 2 fingers ended too soon. "A mean man's glance. Looking for weakness." "Widow's got debts," he said. "Signed papers. Witnessed proper. Briggs means to collect." Clara stepped off the porch. Wind lifted the hem of her black dress. "There was no witness," she said. "He put the paper in front of me after my husband was buried." The rider shrugged. "Paper's still paper." Daniel's jaw tightened. Emma looked from one face to the next. Small and silent in the growing dark. Daniel pushed the gate open just enough to step through. Not enough to invite anyone in. The 2 riders straightened in their saddles, hands loose, watching. Daniel stopped outside the fence with the dusk behind him. Big shoulders. Light brown hair turned dark by shadow. Stubble catching the last thin line of sun. "You ride back," he said. "Tell Briggs the widow works here now." Clara looked at him. The riders did too. The black-hatted man frowned. "Works here until when?" Daniel glanced once over his shoulder toward the yard. Toward Emma. Toward Clara standing with wind and grief in her clothes. Then back to the men. "Till spring court opens." The words settled hard. A fence post driven deep. The rider's mouth bent. "That's near 2 months. Then you best carry the message quick before winter makes it 3. For a second nobody moved. The cold sharpened. A cow lowed from the far pen. Somewhere in the cottonwoods a branch knocked against another like bones. Then the man in the black hat leaned forward in his saddle. "This ranch is smaller than Briggs's anger." Daniel's voice stayed low. "But my grave won't fit on his land." The shotgun rider spat into the dirt. Both men turned their horses. Not hurried. Not careless. The kind of leaving that promised a return. Their hoofbeats faded down the road. Only then did Daniel step back through the gate. He chained it shut. Checked the latch twice. Emma let out a breath she had been holding too long. Clara stood where she was, eyes fixed on Daniel. "You didn't have to do that." He faced the yard, not her. "Yes," he said. "I did." He walked to the porch and picked up the kindling she had stacked. Held it a second. Then nodded toward the house. "Stove's cold," he said. Clara didn't move. The words were too unexpected. Emma did. Her whole face changed. "Inside?" Daniel looked at the shut door. The one he had guarded like a tomb. His shoulders rose once. Fell again. "Till spring," he said. "After that, court decides what belongs to who. You work. You keep the place straight. No questions about rooms I keep shut. No promises past the thaw." Clara looked at the house. At the dark window. At the man forcing himself to stand near both. It was not kindness. Not yet. It was something harder. A bargain made against weather and men. She nodded once. "Till spring." Daniel opened the door. Warmth did not meet them. Only cold ash. Still air. Dust touched by dying light. But Emma smiled like she had seen fire already. Clara stepped inside carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the weight of being allowed to remain. Daniel entered last. Set the kindling by the dead stove. Then closed the door against the wind. Outside, night spread across the valley. And somewhere beyond the dark pasture, Walter Briggs had just been given an answer he would not forgive. Morning found frost silvering the pasture. Smoke climbed slow from the Crowe chimney. Thin. Uncertain. But alive. Daniel Crowe stood in the yard tightening a saddle cinch while the sun lifted over the eastern hills. The leather creaked. His hands moved steady. The same hands that once closed a house for years now kept drifting toward the door. Not opening it. Just checking. Inside, the stove carried its first fire in a long time. Clara Whitlock knelt beside it with sleeves rolled past her wrists. Ash smudged her cheek. A skillet hissed above the flame. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor nearby. Watching. Learning. The girl kept glancing toward the door like she expected her father to walk in any second. Clara noticed. "He'll smell the bacon soon enough," she said. Emma smiled. Small. Hopeful. Outside, Daniel lifted a bucket of oats into the trough. The cattle pushed forward. Steam rising from their breath. Routine. Simple work. Yet the yard felt different now. Not silent. Not hollow. From the open window came the faint crackle of the stove. The quiet murmur of Clara moving inside. Daniel paused beside the fence. Listening. A sound he had not allowed in years. Home. Emma burst through the door a moment later. "Papa." Her boots clattered down the steps. "Food's ready." Daniel wiped his hands on a rag. Glanced once toward the ridge. Then followed her inside. The house still smelled of old dust and cold wood. But the fire pushed warmth through the room. Clara stood by the stove setting plates on the table. The movements were careful. Respectful of the place. Like she understood it belonged to ghosts. Daniel sat without speaking. Emma climbed onto her chair beside him. Clara placed the skillet down. Eggs. Bacon. Cornbread warmed in the pan. Daniel studied the plate. Then looked at Clara. "You cook like you've run a ranch." "Ran a house before the land went with it," she answered. He nodded once. They ate in silence. But it was a different silence now. Not empty. Just quiet. Outside, a crow cried over the fields. Wind nudged the window frame. Emma swung her feet beneath the table. Clara watched Daniel. Every motion. The way he kept glancing toward the western hills. Like trouble might appear if he looked away too long. After breakfast he rose without a word. Reached for his coat. Clara spoke first. "Fence line north, pastures leaning." Daniel stopped. "You checked it already?" She nodded. "Wires sagging where the frost lifted the posts." Daniel studied her a moment. Then tossed her a pair of work gloves from the shelf. "Come see it." They rode out together. Daniel on the gray gelding. Clara walking beside him with Emma perched behind the saddle horn. The pasture stretched white and pale under winter light. Clara moved along the fence, testing each post. Strong. Efficient. Daniel watched. "You've done this before." "Widow learns quick," she said. Emma gathered loose nails in her pocket, passing them up like treasure. The work filled the morning. Hammer blows. Wire pulled tight. Boots crunching frost. Little by little the fence stood straight again. Daniel leaned against the rail when they finished, looking out over the valley. Clara followed his gaze. "What's out there besides Briggs?" Daniel answered without turning. "Men who follow his money." Emma brushed dirt from her hands. "Will they come here again?" Daniel looked down at her. The girl's face carried no fear. Just a question. "Probably." Clara drove the last staple into the post. The metal rang sharp in the cold air. "Well," she said, "then we best keep this place standing." Daniel looked at her then. Longer this time. The wind lifted her dark hair. Dust across her sleeves. No complaint in her eyes. Just resolve. Back at the ranch yard the sun slid lower. Emma carried firewood to the porch. Clara scrubbed the table clean. Daniel fixed the loose hinge on the barn door. 3 lives moving around each other. Not touching much. But no longer strangers. Night came early again. The stove burned steady now. Orange light dancing across the walls. Emma fell asleep by the fire with her head against Clara's knee. Daniel stood in the doorway watching them. Something inside the house had shifted. Warmth pushing against old grief. But the wind carried another sound. Distant. Hoofbeats far off on the western road. Daniel stepped onto the porch. The valley lay dark and quiet beneath the rising moon. He listened a long moment. Then rested his hand on the rail. Inside the house the fire crackled. Emma stirred softly in her sleep. Clara's shadow moved across the wall. For the first time in years, the Crowe Ranch felt like a place people might live again. And somewhere beyond the Black Hills, Walter Briggs was beginning to hear about it. Morning broke cold and pale over the Crowe Ranch. The stove still glowed red in the kitchen. Clara Whitlock stood beside it kneading dough on the table. Flour dust drifted in the warm light like slow snow. Emma sat nearby with a rag and a tin cup. Polishing. Careful. Outside, Daniel Crowe saddled the gray gelding. Leather straps pulled tight under his steady hands. The ranch had settled into rhythm these past days. Work. Meals. Quiet nights. Almost peaceful. Almost. Daniel paused with the saddle blanket halfway folded. Something had changed. The cattle were restless along the north pasture. Low, uneasy sounds drifting across the frost. He stepped onto the fence rail and looked out. 3 posts down. The fence sagged again. Not broken. Cut. Clean. A wire strand hung loose where pliers had worked it free. Daniel climbed down slowly. His boots pressed deep in the frozen soil. Tracks lay in the dirt beyond the fence. Horse tracks. 2 riders. Not bothering to hide them. Inside the house, Emma laughed. A small sound. Light as birds. Daniel studied the open gap. Then he bent and pulled the wire back through the staple. Twisted it tight again. The wind carried dust across the pasture. A warning that did not speak. Clara stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a cloth. Something wrong? Daniel nodded once toward the fence. She walked over. Saw the cut wire. Briggs? Daniel didn't answer. But the silence said enough. Emma came running down the steps with a piece of warm bread in her hand. Papa, look. Daniel crouched. Took the bread. Broke a piece off and handed it back. His eyes never left the pasture. Stay close today, he said. Emma nodded. Serious now. The day moved on. Daniel worked the fence line again. Clara carried water to the trough. Emma gathered eggs in the coop. But the ranch no longer felt quiet. Each sound carried farther. Each movement seemed watched. Near midday, a wagon appeared on the road. Not a ranch wagon. Town paint. Black iron trim. Daniel wiped sweat from his brow and stepped toward the yard. The wagon rolled slow through the gate without asking. 2 men rode the seat. One thin. One heavy. Both wearing clean coats meant for offices, not dust. The heavy man climbed down first. A leather case in his hand. Mr. Crowe, he said. Voice smooth as oil. County office. Daniel stood still. The thin man unfolded a paper from the case. Notice of claim transfer. Clara stepped closer from the porch. Emma stayed behind her skirt. The thin man read. Words long and dry. Land debt. Unpaid interest. Property under review. Daniel's jaw hardened. Clara spoke. My husband's debt died with him. The heavy man smiled politely. Not according to Walter Briggs. The name sat in the yard like poison. Emma looked up at Daniel. The girl could feel the air tightening. The thin man handed Daniel the paper. Court hearing in spring. Until then, the heavy man added, the widow remains under claim dispute. Clara reached for the paper. Her hands shook once. Then steadied. This land isn't his. The heavy man tipped his hat. Perhaps. But Mr. Briggs has influence. Daniel folded the paper once. Then again. Slow. Careful. The thin man stepped back toward the wagon. Just delivering notice, he said. Wouldn't want misunderstandings. The wagon rolled out the gate as calmly as it came. Dust trailed behind its wheels. Emma clutched Clara's hand. Are they taking the ranch? Clara knelt beside her. Not today. Daniel stood staring at the folded paper. The valley stretched quiet beyond the pasture. But the quiet felt different now. Heavy. Waiting. He walked to the fence again. Looked toward the distant hills where Walter Briggs's land spread wide across the valley floor. Clara joined him. You knew this was coming. Daniel nodded. Men like Briggs don't ride themselves. The wind lifted the edges of the notice in his hand. Emma stood behind them on the porch. Small. Still. Daniel crushed the paper in his fist. Then smoothed it flat again. Carefully. Like a man preparing for a fight he cannot walk away from. The ranch yard returned to its work. Water buckets. Hammer strikes. Firewood stacked by the door. But something had changed. The land itself seemed to know it. A shadow had reached the Crowe ranch. And it carried Walter Briggs's name. The wind turned sharp that night. It slid through the pasture grass and rattled the barn boards like loose bones. Inside the Crowe house the stove burned low and steady. Clara Whitlock sat at the kitchen table with a folded notice spread before her. The paper had creases where Daniel's fist had crushed it. Ink still dark. Words still cold. Emma slept in the chair beside the stove. One hand curled under her cheek. Daniel stood near the window watching the dark yard. The lantern light touched the edge of his face. Not the rest. Clara, read the notice again. Slow. Careful. Property under dispute. Debt transfer. Valley water rights. That last line caught her eye. She frowned. Daniel didn't turn. You find something? Maybe. Clara ran a finger along the paragraph. The claim isn't about land. Daniel glanced back. Then what? The creek. Outside the cottonwoods whispered along the water line. Daniel walked over. The boards creaked beneath his boots. Clara slid the paper toward him. This says the land attached to the water source becomes collateral. Daniel studied the words. His brow tightened. That creek barely runs half the year. Clara shook her head. Not the upper spring. Daniel looked up. What spring? Clara stood and crossed to the shelf near the stove. She reached behind a stack of ledgers. Pulled out an old folded map. Yellowed. Edges soft from years of handling. My husband kept this. She spread it across the table. Emma stirred but did not wake. The lantern light revealed thin lines drawn across the valley. Pasture marks. Fence lines. Creek bends. Clara pointed toward the hills above Daniel's north pasture. Here. Daniel leaned closer. A small mark sat near the ridge. Barely noticeable. What's that? A survey spring. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's on my side of the valley. Clara nodded. And if that spring feeds the creek? Daniel finished the thought. Then whoever controls the spring controls the valley water. The wind struck the window. Hard. Emma shifted in her sleep. Daniel studied the map again. His finger traced the ridge line. Then the lower pasture. Then the creek running through Briggs' land. That spring ain't marked in any town records. Clara folded the notice slowly. That's why Briggs wants the land claim. Daniel straightened. The realization settled in his chest like iron. It had never been about Clara's debt. It had been about water. And water meant power. Outside, a horse snorted in the barn. Daniel grabbed his coat. Clara looked up. Where are you going? North pasture. It's dark. Spring's up that ridge. Clara stood. I'm coming. Daniel hesitated. Then nodded once. They stepped out into the cold night. Moonlight spread across the pasture like pale fire. Their boots crunched frost as they crossed the field. The cattle lifted their heads as the pair passed. Silent watchers. The climb toward the ridge grew steep. Wind stronger there. Grass bending low against the stones. Clara followed Daniel's steps carefully. Emma's lantern swung in Daniel's hand. Light cutting a narrow path through the dark. Halfway up the ridge, Daniel stopped. He crouched. Touched the ground. Wet soil. He dug his fingers into the earth. Water seeped between the dirt grains. Clara knelt beside him. The faint sound reached them then. A soft trickle. Hidden beneath the grass. Daniel pushed aside a cluster of rocks. Cold water spilled clear from a narrow seam in the hill. The spring. Clara exhaled slowly. It's real. Daniel cupped the water in his hand. Cold as winter steel. Below them the valley stretched dark and wide. The creek twisting through Briggs' land like a snake. Now Daniel understood. The spring above his pasture fed the entire valley flow. Every ranch. Every field. Every herd. If Briggs owned the water, he owned the valley. Daniel stood. The wind lifted his coat. Clara watched the realization settle across his face. Court won't see this, she said quietly. Not unless someone shows them. Daniel looked down toward the ranch. A faint glow from the house fire flickered in the distance. Emma slept there. Safe. For now. Behind them the spring continued its quiet song. Hidden. Forgotten. Until tonight. Daniel picked up the lantern again. His voice low. Almost to himself. "Briggs buried this on purpose." Clara nodded. "And if the town learns it?" Daniel finished the thought. "His whole claim dies." They stood in silence a moment longer. The wind carried the smell of water and stone. Then Daniel turned back toward the ranch. The lantern swung in his hand. Small light against the black valley. Behind them the spring flowed quietly through the hill. A secret that could break the richest man in the valley. If they lived long enough to prove it. Night settled heavy over the Crowe ranch. The stove burned low. Orange coals breathing quiet heat into the kitchen. Emma slept on the rug with her blanket pulled to her chin. Clara Whitlock sat at the table with the old survey map spread flat beneath the lantern. Daniel Crowe leaned against the wall beside the window, watching the dark pasture. Neither of them spoke. The spring in the hills had changed everything. Outside the wind moved through the grass like whispers. Clara folded the map again. "Careful. This can stop him," she said quietly. Daniel didn't answer. His eyes had narrowed toward the north pasture. Something moved there. A flicker. Then another. Lanterns. 3. Riders coming down the ridge. Daniel straightened. The quiet in the house tightened. Clara followed his gaze through the window. "Briggs' men?" Daniel nodded once. He crossed the room. Lifted the rifle from its hooks beside the door. Emma stirred in her sleep. Clara touched the girl's shoulder. "Stay here," she whispered. Daniel stepped onto the porch. Cold night air wrapped the yard. The riders didn't hurry. Lanterns swinging from their saddles. Confidence in every slow step. Daniel rested the rifle against the porch rail. Waited. The riders stopped just outside the gate. 4 men now. The lantern light revealed hard faces and dusted coats. One man raised his voice. "Evenin', Crowe." Daniel said nothing. The man tipped his hat back. "Mr. Briggs sends word." Clara stepped into the doorway behind Daniel. The men noticed her. Their smiles grew thin. The rider continued. "Widow Whitlock's claim has stirred up a lot of interest." Daniel's voice stayed low. "You delivered your paper already?" The man chuckled. "Paper's just the start." Behind them another rider struck a match. A small flame blinked to life. Then another. Daniel's grip tightened on the rifle. The riders dismounted. 2 walked toward the fence. Each carrying something in their hands. Bottles. Clara's breath caught. Kerosene. Daniel stepped off the porch. "You pour that and you don't ride home." The man laughed again. "You shoot one of us. Briggs owns this valley by morning." The riders moved anyway. One bottle shattered against the dry grass near the corral. The smell hit the air instantly. Sharp. Oil and danger. The second bottle followed. Daniel raised the rifle. The men kept moving. A match struck. Clara grabbed Emma's blanket and pulled the girl into the doorway. "Daniel." Flame touched the ground. Fire leapt across the grass like it had been waiting all night. The dry winter pasture caught fast. Orange light exploded across the yard. Cattle bawled inside the corral. Daniel fired once. The shot cracked across the valley. One rider's lantern shattered. Darkness swallowed half the yard. The other men mounted fast, laughing as they rode. The fire spread along the fence line. Daniel ran toward the flames. Boots pounding frozen soil. He kicked dirt across the first blaze. Clara rushed to the pump, water bucket filling slow. Too slow. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, eyes wide with firelight dancing across her face. "Emma." Clara's voice broke the spell. The girl ran with a second bucket. Daniel stomped at the grass fire. Boots beating flame into smoking dirt. Another line of fire reached the corral. The cattle panicked. Wood cracked. Clara hurled the first bucket over the fence post. Steam rose where water hit flame. Daniel grabbed a shovel from the barn wall. Scooped dirt. Threw it hard over the spreading blaze. Minute by minute the fire fought them. Wind pushed it. Grass fed it. The riders' hoofbeats faded into the hills. But their work stayed behind. Emma brought another bucket. Then another. Clara soaked the fence posts. Daniel carved a line through the grass with a shovel. Finally the fire slowed. Flames shrank to smoking patches. Then to glowing embers. The yard filled with the smell of burned earth. Daniel stood breathing hard beside the blackened fence. His shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold. Clara lowered the empty bucket. Emma clung to her arm. The ranch looked different now. Half the pasture charred dark. Fence posts scorched. Cattle still trembling in the corral. Daniel stared toward the ridge where the riders had vanished. Clara spoke softly. "He knows about the spring." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Not yet. But he knows something." Daniel looked down at the burned ground. Then back at the hills. "They wanted us scared." Emma's voice came small. "Are they coming back?" Daniel rested a hand on her shoulder. His voice quiet. "Count on it." Clara watched the blackened pasture. The attack had not been random. It had been a message. Daniel walked to the rifle lying near the porch. Picked it up slowly. The house behind him glowed warm through the windows. Firelight inside. Smoke outside. The valley had crossed a line tonight. And Walter Briggs had just declared war on the Crowe Ranch. Dawn came slow over the burned pasture. Gray light touched the blackened grass like ash on old bones. Daniel Crowe stood at the fence line with a shovel in his hand. The fire had died hours ago. But the ground still smoked in thin curls. Clara Whitlock walked beside him carrying a bundle of fresh fence wire. Emma followed with a hammer too big for her hands. No one spoke. The valley listened. Daniel drove the shovel into the dirt and levered out the charred post. It cracked loose with a dull sound. He set the new one in place. Clara held the wire steady. Emma passed him the staples one by one. The work moved steady. Simple. But every motion carried weight now. Across the pasture the cattle shifted nervously. Their hooves stirred the black soil where green grass had stood yesterday. Daniel hammered the last staple into the post. The ring of metal carried across the quiet field. Clara wiped soot from her sleeve. "They wanted us to leave." Daniel straightened. His eyes drifted toward the western ridge. "They wanted us weak." Emma looked up from the dirt. "Are we weak?" Daniel rested the hammerhead against the post. "No." The answer came quiet. But solid. A sound like iron. They walked back toward the house. The ranch looked wounded. Half the pasture charred. Fence posts blackened. The corral gate scorched where flame had reached it. Daniel paused beside the barn. His gaze moved across every broken thing. Measuring. Counting. Then he turned to Clara. "You know how to ride?" She nodded. "Well enough." "Good." Emma watched them both. Daniel stepped inside the barn and returned with the gray gelding's saddle. He tightened the cinch with slow care. Clara leaned against the rail. "You going somewhere?" Daniel lifted the rifle from the saddle scabbard. "Check the chamber." "Town." Emma frowned. "Why?" Daniel crouched in front of her. His big hand brushed soot from her cheek. "Because men who burn a ranch think nobody's watching." Emma tilted her head. "But we are." Daniel nodded once. "Exactly." Clara stepped closer. "Briggs owns half the town." Daniel slid the rifle back into the scabbard. "Not the truth." The words hung between them. Heavy. Real. He swung into the saddle. The horse stamped against the cold ground. Emma grabbed the stirrup before he could ride off. "Papa." Daniel looked down. The girl's eyes held more strength than fear now. "Come back." He touched her hair once. "Count on it." The gray gelding turned toward the road. Hooves thudding against frozen dirt. Clara and Emma watched until the dust faded behind the ridge. The house felt bigger after he left. Quieter. Clara carried water to the stove. Emma stacked fresh wood beside the hearth. The fire crackled, warm against the morning chill. But outside the wind carried the smell of smoke from the burned pasture. Clara stepped onto the porch. The valley stretched wide and silent. Briggs' land spread across the western fields. Too quiet. Like a predator waiting. Emma appeared beside her. "Do you think Papa's scared?" Clara watched the horizon. "Yes." Emma looked surprised. "Then why go?" Clara knelt beside her. "Because protecting something means you ride toward the fear." Emma thought about that, then nodded. Miles away, Daniel Crowe rode hard across the valley floor. The town appeared ahead. Wooden buildings. Dust streets. Men already gathering near the general store. News traveled fast in small places. Daniel swung down outside the hitch rail. A few heads turned. Some nodded. Others looked away. He stepped onto the boardwalk. Boots heavy against the wood. The town marshal leaned against the post near the saloon. Old coat. Tired eyes. He saw the rifle first. Then Daniel's face. "What happened out there, Crowe?" Daniel stopped in front of him. "Briggs' men burned my pasture." The marshal sighed. "Got proof?" Daniel held his gaze. "Working on it." A group of ranchers gathered nearby. Listening. Watching. Daniel turned toward them. His voice carried across the quiet street. "Walter Briggs thinks he owns this valley." No one answered. But no one left either. Daniel's hand rested near the rifle. "He burned my land last night." A murmur moved through the crowd. The marshal rubbed his jaw. "You stirring trouble, Crowe?" Daniel looked back toward the hills where his ranch waited. Where Clara and Emma stood against the cold wind. Then he faced the town again. "No." His voice was steady. "I'm ending it." The street went still. Men shifted their boots against the dust. Because something had changed in Daniel Crowe. The quiet rancher who once kept to himself had ridden into town with fire still on his land. And the valley could feel it. The protector had finally stepped forward. The town hall smelled of dust and cold wood. Men filled the benches. Boot heels scraped the plank floor. Low voices drifted like wind through dry grass. Daniel Crowe stood near the back wall. Hat in his hands. Eyes quiet. The marshal leaned against the door frame. Watching the room the way old lawmen do when they know trouble has already arrived. At the front table sat 3 county men. Papers spread before them. Ink bottles. Ledger books. The kind of tools that decide who owns the ground beneath a man's boots. Walter Briggs entered last. The room shifted the moment he stepped inside. Tall. Broad coat. Silver watch chain glinting against his vest. He moved like a man who had already won. 2 riders from the burned pasture stood behind him. The same hard faces Daniel had seen in firelight. Briggs glanced across the room. His eyes landed on Daniel. A smile followed. Thin. Satisfied. Clara Whitlock stepped through the door behind Daniel. Emma beside her. The room noticed them too. A widow. A child. The pieces Briggs thought he had already crushed. Clara held the old survey map tight against her chest. Daniel nodded once toward the front. They walked together through the crowd. Boots and skirts brushing past men who suddenly found the floor interesting. The county clerk cleared his throat. This hearing concerns land and debt claim filed by Mr. Walter Briggs against the estate of Samuel Whitlock. Briggs rested his hands on the table. Calm. Prepared. "The widow's land sits along my water access," he said. "Debt papers transfer control until payment clears." The clerk nodded. Routine words. Routine theft. Clara stepped forward. My husband never signed that debt. Briggs barely looked at her. Paper says otherwise. Murmurs moved through the benches. The marshal shifted his weight near the door. Daniel stayed quiet. Waiting. The clerk tapped his pen against the ledger. Mr. Briggs' documents appear proper. Clara looked toward Daniel. He stepped forward slowly. Boots heavy on the floor. He placed the folded survey map on the table. The clerk frowned. What's this? Daniel's voice stayed low. A reason he wants her land. The clerk unfolded the map. Paper crackled. The lines revealed the valley, pastures, creeks, and the small mark on the ridge. The spring. The room leaned closer. Briggs' smile faded. That map's old, he said quickly. Doesn't change the debt. Daniel rested one hand on the table. Look where the water starts. The clerk traced the ridge line with his finger. Then the creek running through Briggs' land. His brow tightened. The marshal stepped forward. You saying that spring feeds the whole valley? Daniel nodded once. Year-round. A murmur rolled through the room. Ranchers shifted in their seats. Men who knew water meant life. Briggs leaned forward. That spring's not on record. Daniel looked at him. It is now. The marshal spoke. You seen it yourself, Crowe? Daniel answered. Last night. Clara stepped beside him. My husband kept the survey. The clerk studied the map again. Long. Careful. Outside a wagon rattled down the street. The quiet inside the hall deepened. Finally the clerk looked up. If that spring sits on Crowe land. The sentence hung unfinished. But everyone knew the ending. Briggs' jaw hardened. You're trusting ranchers' word over legal paper? The marshal crossed his arms. Paper signed after a man's funeral. Eyes moved around the room. Some nodding. Some whispering. The riders behind Briggs shifted uneasily. The clerk folded the debt paper slowly. Until the spring is surveyed officially. He paused. This claim is suspended. The room breathed out all at once. Briggs slammed his palm against the table. You don't know what you're doing. The marshal's voice stayed calm. Oh, I think we do. Briggs turned toward Daniel. Anger burned clear in his eyes now. This valley runs on my cattle. Daniel didn't raise his voice. It runs on water. Silence answered him. Heavy. Final. The clerk gathered the papers. Hearing adjourned until the survey is completed. Briggs pushed past the benches. Boots striking hard against the floor. His riders followed close behind. The door slammed behind them. Dust drifted in the sunlight through the windows. For a moment no one moved. Then one of the older ranchers near the wall spoke. Crowe found the spring. Another nodded. Means Briggs don't own the creek. The marshal stepped beside Daniel. You just turned the valley upside down. Daniel looked toward Clara. Emma held her hand tight. Clara's eyes shone with quiet strength. Outside the wind carried the smell of thawing earth. The valley had changed. Not with gunfire. Not with fire. But with truth spoken where everyone could hear. And Walter Briggs had just lost the power he thought would last forever. Spring did not arrive all at once on the Crowe ranch. It came by inches. By softened ground under boot heels. By thin green blades pushing through blackened pasture. By creek water running louder each morning beneath the cottonwoods. Daniel Crowe stood at the north fence before sunrise, one hand resting on the top rail, watching mist lift from the valley floor. The scarred posts from the fire still stood in places where they had not yet been changed. Black wood against pale dawn. A reminder. Not of fear. Of survival. Behind him, the ranch house glowed faint gold through the kitchen window. Someone had lit the stove before daylight. Someone had opened the curtains. Years ago, that would have felt like trespass. Now it felt like breath. Daniel pushed off the fence and walked toward the barn. The gray gelding lifted its head when he entered. A horse always knew the difference between a man carrying trouble and a man carrying purpose. Daniel laid a hand on the gelding's neck. Calm. Warm. He reached for the harness hanging on the peg. Not saddle. Harness. A wagon day. The small choice made the whole barn feel different. No rifle in hand. No tension in the shoulders. Just leather creaking in the quiet and hay dust hanging in the early light. Outside, a screen door tapped softly. Then again. Clara Whitlock stepped onto the porch with a basin in her arms. Morning light caught the edge of her hair. Dark brown. Loosely braided. No longer hidden under grief like when she first rode into his life on broken knees and wind-blown dust. She still wore plain things. A dark work dress. A faded apron tied at the waist. But the black widow's weight had begun to leave her clothes. Leave her posture. Leave her eyes. Emma came behind her carrying a cloth twice too big for her hands. The girl's braids bounced against her shoulders as she crossed the porch boards. 3 years old. Too small to be hauling laundry. Too determined to be stopped. Clara smiled at something the child whispered. Daniel could not hear the words from the barn. He did not need to. The sound of that smile carried enough. He led the gray gelding out and began hitching the wagon. Clara looked up from the wash line. You're taking the long road today. Daniel adjusted the trace chain. Need lumber from town. Emma hurried down the path and stopped near the wheel. Can I go? Daniel looked down at her. Freckles. Dusty blue-gray dress. A lighter patch sewn into the sleeve where Clara had mended it neat as a bookkeeper's line. The child had arrived in his house like a voice from somewhere better than grief. Now she stood in his yard like she belonged there. He nodded once. After breakfast. Emma grinned and ran back toward the porch. Clara watched her go. Then looked at Daniel. You don't have to say yes every time. He tightened the strap one more notch. Didn't. The corner of Clara's mouth lifted. That small. That quiet. Enough to stay with him. Breakfast smelled of cornbread and bacon fat and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Emma talked through half of it. About chicks in the coop. About a crooked cloud. About how the creek sounded bigger this morning. Daniel listened more than he spoke. That had not changed. But he stayed at the table longer now. That had. The old empty chair across from him no longer looked like a grave marker. It looked used. Lived in. Clara rose to refill the coffee pot and paused by the kitchen shelf. Her fingers brushed the little tin music box sitting there. A thing Daniel's late wife had kept near the window for years. It had not been touched since the funeral. Not once. Clara had dusted around it for weeks. Never moved it. Never asked. This morning she picked it up to wipe beneath it. Careful. Respectful. Daniel watched from the table. His hand tightened slightly around the coffee cup. Clara noticed. Her eyes lifted to his. A question without pressure. Daniel looked at the music box. At the worn brass edge. At the tiny painted flowers nearly rubbed away. Then he gave one slow nod. Clara said it back gently. Not hidden. Not sacred. Just part of the room again. Emma looked between them. Children caught the changes adults tried not to name. The girl lowered her voice without knowing why. Was that Mama's? Daniel set the cup down. Yeah. Emma stared at the little box. Then at Clara. Then back to him. Can it stay there? Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked around the kitchen. Firelight stains long gone from winter. Curtains open. Sun on the floorboards. Bread cooling on the towel. Clara near the stove. Emma beside him. He answered without drama. It should. The room grew very still after that. Not empty stillness. Full stillness. The kind that comes when something buried has finally been laid down proper. By late morning the wagon rolled toward town with Daniel on the bench and Emma beside him, legs too short to reach the floorboard. The road ran past fields just beginning to green, past fences rebuilt straight, past neighbors who now tipped their hats instead of pretending not to see him. News traveled slow in winter, fast in spring. A man who stood up to Walter Briggs and won backwater for the valley did not remain invisible long. At the lumber yard, men greeted Daniel with a respect that would have made him uncomfortable months ago. Now he took it the same way he took weather, as something that came and went. Emma chose a sack of seed potatoes from the supply porch after studying each one like a banker choosing investments. Daniel let her. At the general store she pointed to a strip of blue ribbon hanging near the cloth bolts. "Can we get that?" He looked at the ribbon, then at her braids. "For what?" She smiled like it was obvious. "For Clara." He did not answer right away. The storekeeper pretended to sort nails. Old men near the stove pretended not to listen. Daniel took the ribbon down and laid 2 coins on the counter. Emma hugged it to her chest all the way home. Halfway back, clouds gathered over the western ridge. Not storm clouds, just a drifting gray bank that dropped the temperature a little and pushed a sharper wind across the road. The wagon creaked over a washout near the creek. One rear wheel thudded hard into the rut and the sack of seed potatoes slipped sideways. Emma grabbed at it and nearly lost her balance. Daniel's arm moved fast across her middle. "Steady." "Sure." He pulled her back against the seat and held her there until the wagon cleared the wash. The child blinked up at him, startled. He released her slowly. "Sit back." Emma nodded. No tears, just a solemn little face learning something important. That safety could arrive in a rough voice and a strong arm just as surely as in soft words. They reached the ranch under a cooler sky. Clara was at the well, pulling water. She turned at the sound of wheels. The sight of them coming home seemed to ease something in her shoulders every single time. Daniel noticed that now, the same way he noticed the lamp in the window at dusk. The extra plate set without asking. The way Emma ran first to Clara with every small triumph. The wagon had barely stopped before the girl climbed down and ran across the yard with the ribbon. Clara knelt to catch her. Emma opened her fist. Blue against the plain dark of Clara's dress. "For you." Clara blinked, looked at the ribbon, then toward the wagon. Daniel was already unloading lumber. Not watching. At least pretending not to. Clara understood anyway. Some gifts come wrapped in paper, others in silence. She tied the ribbon into one braid with careful fingers. The color changed her at once. Not because blue was bright. Because it was chosen. Because somebody had imagined her in tomorrow, not only in sorrow. The afternoon passed in work. Always work. But lighter now. Daniel and Clara repaired the old garden fence while Emma dropped seed potatoes into shallow furrows with great concentration. The air smelled of turned earth and sun-warmed boards. A flock of blackbirds settled in the far field and lifted again as one. The creek kept speaking from beyond the cottonwoods. A ranch sound. A living sound. Near the corner post, Daniel found a loose length of wire half buried in the dirt. Old. Rusting. Left over from before the fire. He pulled it free and tossed it aside. Clara glanced at the motion. A tiny thing. Still, it sharpened the air for a second. Because both of them knew what had once happened on this ground. What had almost been taken. What could still be remembered if they let memory rule the place. Emma looked up from the row. "What is it?" Daniel drove the shovel into the soil. "Nothing that stays." He said it to the child. He meant it for the land. By dusk the potatoes were in. The fence stood straight. The wash was done and pinned. Smoke rose from the chimney in a blue thread against the evening sky. Inside, Clara set stew on the table. Not fancy. Just beef, onions, carrots, and the last of the winter herbs. The kind of meal that settles a house from the inside out. Emma nodded over her spoon before the second helping. By the time Clara carried the bowls to the basin, the child was half asleep in the chair. Daniel stood, crossed the room, and lifted Emma carefully into his arms. She stirred only enough to tuck her face against his shoulder. Her small hand curled against his shirt. Clara stopped with the bowl still in her hands. Watched him. There are moments a woman remembers because they answer questions she never dared ask aloud. This was one of them. Daniel carried Emma to the small bedroom off the hall. The same room that had once held silence and stored sorrow and too many unopened boxes. Now a small quilt lay over the bed. A rag doll sat in the corner chair. A child's shoes rested crooked by the wall. He knelt and laid her down. Pulled the blanket up under her chin. Emma's eyes fluttered open just once. "Papa?" "Yeah." "Home now?" Daniel looked at her for a long second. Then touched the loose braid away from her cheek. "Yeah," he said. "Home now." When he came back to the kitchen, Clara had finished clearing the table. Only the low lamp remained lit. Firelight moved gently across the walls. She stood by the window twisting the dish towel in her hands. Not from fear. From courage. Daniel stopped near the table. The room between them was not large. It still felt like something had to cross it carefully. Clara looked out toward the pasture where darkness had settled soft over the land. "I used to think peace would feel loud," she said quietly. Daniel waited. She turned toward him. "But it doesn't." "No. It feels like being allowed to exhale." He looked at the lamp glow on the window glass. At the reflection of the room behind them. At her standing inside it. He did not waste words. Never had. "You are." That nearly undid her. Not in grief. In relief. Clara lowered her eyes for a moment, then lifted them again. "Emma asked me something yesterday." Daniel's shoulders stilled. "What?" "She asked if I was staying even after spring got here." He said nothing. The fire cracked softly behind him. Outside, a nightbird called once near the creek. Clara took one step closer. "I told her that was not my choice alone." Daniel looked down at his left hand resting near the table edge. At the missing fingers. At the old shame that had once made him believe broken men should live alone and ask nothing from anybody. Then he looked up. The answer was there long before the words. "You staying?" Clara's breath caught. Not because she had not hoped. Because hope spoken aloud always sounds more dangerous than silence. "Yes," she said. That one word changed the room. Changed the dark beyond the window. Changed the future sitting quiet in every corner of the house. Daniel crossed the remaining space slowly. Not like a man claiming anything. Like a man arriving. He took the dish towel gently from her hands and set it on the table. Then his rough palm found hers. Warm. Work-worn. Steady. No speeches. No grand vows. Just the truth standing plain between them. Outside, the spring-fed creek moved through the valley Daniel had nearly lost. Inside, the lamp glowed over a table used by 3 people instead of 1. The old music box sat on the shelf. The blue ribbon waited in Clara's braid. A child slept down the hall believing home was a thing that stayed. And Daniel Crowe, who had once built his life around silence, finally stood in the center of a house filled with small sounds he no longer feared. The settling beam. The soft fire. The wind at the porch. The breathing of people who belonged. By the time the lamp was turned down low, the Crowe Ranch no longer felt like a place where sorrow had stopped time. It felt like what Emma had named it from the beginning. A home. Earned. Repaired. And warm enough at last for the future to stay.
If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again, hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past, and your heart pointed west.